Well, now it's time to look at just how to best determine the ways that technology and media can be used to support universal design. There's, as you saw, hundreds of ways to even think about universal design and the strategies and guidelines, but then there's dozens and dozens of technology tools. So just how do we pick the best ones, and how do we begin to apply them in the most effective ways? What is important to you when selecting media for your learners? What do you think about? So just take a moment and pause and ponder what guides your thinking when you're picking a technology for your classroom. The goals of the presentation today will be to identify factors relevant to your UDL media selection, and also to look at 3 technologies that are really useful for supporting UDL. Before we begin, let's look at some suppositions or some assumptions. What are some claims or some thoughts about UDL and technology? And the 3 claims we're going to look at are actually, for the most part, false. So the first thing is that complex tech equals better UDL. Well, in reality, complex tech does not equal better UDL. To help us think more about that, here's a good quote. Even, or perhaps especially, techies can benefit from the opportunity to move down the complexity scale in order to practice UDL. It's not always a process of moving up to more technology or more complexity. You see, there is a lot of technology out there, but sometimes if we're just looking for the most complicated way and think that it's automatically going to be better, that's a false assumption. I have a personal example. When I was teaching 5th grade science, and I had a lesson that I wanted to teach about climate zones and their relationship to the flora and fauna in a region, I thought it'd be excellent to have students use Google Earth and tag different regions and add photos and layers and icons, and they all had different meanings. And what I found is that students spent so much time trying to just learn how to use Google Earth that it took away from understanding the content. And eventually I had to redo the lesson, and I used simple materials, simple technologies like scissors and glue and some paper, and ended up the learning outcomes were far better. And so again, when you're looking to select technology, complex doesn't always mean better designed learning for our learners. Well, maybe just more technology, right, would be better UDL. Not necessarily, right? And by this, we're talking digital technologies. So sometimes it's okay to just add some text, right? If you find yourself always looking for videos or games to add to your online classroom, some of your learners may do better by reading the information, or maybe do better by looking at a picture or some slides. Remember, it's about providing them options for representation. So if all I'm doing is just providing, here's 5 videos about climate, well, it's all the same method of representation. It's all videos. So just adding more and more of the same is not necessarily going to be better. And that brings us to multimedia does not equal universal design for learning. So by multimedia, we're often talking about the mixture of audio and video and images, right? So you show a YouTube video, that would be multimedia. That doesn't mean that we're automatically doing universal design for learning. Again, universal design, we're looking for multiple means to recruit their interest, multiple means of representing information, and multiple means of engaging or giving them action and expression. So for instance, if I show a video to my learners, and if I have a learner who is not able to see the screen, then I'm not representing the content for that learner. Or if I have a learner who is a speaker of another language and I haven't used a video source that can translate the video, then I'm not engaging that learner. And if I have learners who don't have a good enough internet connection to stream the quality of video that I've posted, again, I'm not engaging those learners. So there are moments in time when this form of media is not going to benefit our entire class. UDL is not about making learners cycle through a variety but rather about providing choices so learners can decide how they want to experience interactions. So this gets into the idea that I'm not pointlessly just throwing a bunch of media into my online modules. The goal is to give learners a choice when they're approaching a learning outcome about how they are going to learn the material or express their learning. And so if I have a unit on, let's say, urban, suburban, and rural communities, I should provide them choices for how they want to learn about each of those communities. It shouldn't just be, here's a video about urban communities, here's a reading about suburban communities, and here's a lecture about rural communities. The variety there, they're just cycling through, but they're still expected to use a video for one, a reading for another, and a lecture for the third. A UDL approach would say you need to provide choices for your learners for the first learning outcome, choices for the second, and choices for the third. When we're selecting those choices, when we're selecting from those different media, there are going to be different factors that might influence our thinking. Chelman published this, what she calls the media selection wheel. We're going to look at it in two parts. The first part asks, how will the media support the effective communication of content objectives? So notice the inner part here where we're looking at the goals and objectives. So does the technology that I'm choosing support the learning outcome for this lesson? Who are my learners? What are their background knowledge? You know, in my case, my learners had never used Google Earth in the way that I was trying to get them to use it. I needed to take that into consideration, their skills with technology, as well as their content knowledge, and other factors that I might have about the different learning disabilities that my students might bring, maybe cultural factors of my learners, etc. Activities, what am I trying to have my learners do, and does the technology actually support the activity I'm planning? And then feasibility. In my case, Google Earth took way too much time, and it took away from the lesson. I ran out of time to really effectively teach it because I was troubleshooting the technology the whole time. And so feasibility is an essential part of effective communication. When we go to the outer ring of this circle, it's really looking about whether your school and your community of learners are going to readily latch onto that technology. So if we look at things like the time, the amount of time it'll take for you to maybe build the technology if you're recording your own video, or the amount of time it'll take learners to learn how to use it, does the technology cost a certain amount that would be prohibitive to adoption? Does the content you're teaching, does it work well with this technology? And then the culture is both the culture of your school. So sometimes you might end up in a school that like everything they use is Google because the whole school has Google Chrome, or that you might end up in what's called like a Microsoft school, or you'll have smart schools versus Promethean schools. So certain institutional cultures get built around the technology that's adopted, and certain technologies will then be supported more than others. And that's important for you to consider. Culture is also referring to the learner's culture. So as you're picking media, picking, say, videos, are the cultures in your classroom represented well? Does the media stereotypically represent cultures? Are you giving students from different cultures a chance to add and incorporate their culture into the media in the classroom? And then we get into learning environment, which would be example for my teaching. My learning environment was not built to support a one-to-one environment, but eventually my school gave me a whole set of netbooks. And the problem was my learning environment, I didn't have plugs to plug them in. So they were constantly, the batteries were running down, and we'd have students without laptops. And so even though I tried to use the technology in what was a way, it fit with my content and it wasn't costly. We already had them, but my learning environment, the infrastructure didn't support that. And then support refers to if you have the support at your school, right? Some schools will have a specific tech person, and other schools might have a teacher who helps out. And then development environment is if they're providing additional spaces for you to create content. So the school I was at actually had a room with a green screen where classes could go in and create more professional looking videos. So here's some examples, right? And I wanted to start out simple to show you that it doesn't have to be, I mean, the last thing I just said was a room with a green screen, right? So clearly some schools have the capability for more complex tech use, but it doesn't always have to be complicated. So in this example, Google Slides can support multiple means of representation through captioning. I don't have the captioning on right now because I'm planning to use the video captioning for this presentation. But if you were presenting live to students, say in Zoom or WebEx, any form of video conferencing, you can come down, scroll down to where you see captions, and if you click here, it will start the captions, but you also have the option here to change the size or the position. I have now started the captions. You should see them at the top of the screen, and as long as your microphone is picking up your voice and you are speaking clearly enough, the captions tend to be fairly accurate. And I will turn those back off. So again, you're representing your information in multiple ways now, visually, auditorily, and you have the text. The next example, I won't navigate to the site, but here's the link, and I'll post this presentation on Blackboard, and here's a screenshot. And it's really as simple as a record button, and your students now have, the UDL guidelines are supported that optimizes choice. They can choose if they want to type in a response to a question in your online classroom, or they could record, and then this, when you finish recording, gives you an option to download the file, to share it as a link. They can copy and paste it, they can email it, they can even put a QR code. And so it also offers alternatives for visual information. Instead of just posting text or even a presentation in your learning management system, you could record your lesson or even record yourself reading a document, because your voice reading is going to be a lot more engaging than a screen reader for your students. And now you can put, offer alternatives for that visual information. And then the last one is varying methods of response, which goes back to optimizing choice. And this is multiple means of action expression. So you're now giving your students one more different way, very simple. They press the record button, they talk into the microphone, they stop it, and they have a file. Super simple way to just respond to the content in a new form. The last one, this one's a little more complicated. Adobe Spark, free version, has a lot of things you can do with it, that you can upgrade it, but students can make websites, they can make videos, they can make posters, a lot of support. And so now if you use this to make content, you're providing an additional way of representing your information, and if you have students learn how to use it, they can express their learning in different ways as well. Even just through this single website, they can choose whether they want to make the poster to represent their learning or the video, and so on. If you go to my presentation here, I do have a video example of a student submission using Adobe Spark, as well as a tutorial, a few ideas for exploring this tool, and you can then send me any additional questions you have.